Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what Indians are all about.
I still say we Indian people are believers in the truth. This is the way of life that was given to your people. You're born an Indian, you're going to die an Indian. Indianness is a good life. You're facing an Indian this afternoon.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's NAJA Virtual Roundtable into the Broken Trust investigation. Our panelists will discuss and elaborate on a series of stories launched by the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network's investigative team that led to an independent inquiry into the treatment of Indigenous women by the state police. The team, Aptn Investigates, is this year's Richard LaCourse Award for Investigative Journalism winner for this reporting and its impact. Our panel moderator is Francine Compton, the current NAJA president and the executive show producer at APTN National News.
Miigwech, Brian, Anin viewers, I'm Francine Compton. I'm here at APTN's world headquarters in Winnipeg, Canada. Thank you for tuning in. And as Brian mentioned, we're here to discuss the APTN investigation into broken trust. Just to give you a little bit of a background before we meet our panelists and before we get talking, APTN Investigates had been working with a woman who was a victim of a scheme in British Columbia here in Canada. In the town known as Kelowna, a social worker there was found to be taking advantage of vulnerable Indigenous youth who are in the child welfare system. And our award-winning video journalist, who's not with us today, Colin Crozier, he's out there working, producing a story, but he wrote and directed an episode about the cases that went to trial from that scheme. And Broken Trust aired on APTN in March of 2019. Now, out of that civil trial, an interrogation video emerged as evidence. APTN Investigates producer stayed in very close touch with the victim and exclusively obtained that tape. Now, the tape that showed Kelowna RCMP officer, an officer with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that's Canada's federal police. That officer was on that tape aggressively interrogating an underage Indigenous woman who's in the care of the child welfare system. The interrogation was about her reported sexual assault. Now our producer went on to expertly and exclusively work with the woman, producing a number of stories that led to an external review of all sexual assault cases handled by that Kelowna RCMP detachment. And that led to the revelation that the numbers of under-investigated sexual assault cases in Kelowna were 40% higher than the rest of Canada. And it's important to note that that offered a very rare glimpse into how some Indigenous women are treated in the Canadian justice system. And it was a theme born out of the testimonies at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous women and girls. Now that I've given a brief introduction of why we're here and what brought us together, let's meet our panel. We're joined by Ojibwe journalist Mary Pember. She is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Wisconsin Ojibwe tribe. She is currently the national correspondent for Indian Country Today. Her work has been published at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian, just to name a few. Mary served as president of NAJA between 2000 and 2002 and also held the position of executive director. And to give you a sense of the stories that Mary has reported on, she was a fellow at the University of Maryland Journalism Fellowship in Child and Family Policy. She won a Clarion Award from the Association for Women in Communications for Best Feature Writing for stories exposing sex trafficking of Native women. And most recently, Mary was recognized with the Native American Journalists Medill School of Journalism Lifetime Achievement Award. That was in 2018. Thank you, Mary, for being on the panel with us today. Now to introduce you to my APTN colleagues, Holly Moore, the producer of APTN Investigates. She comes to us with well over 16 years of experience working on news and investigative news and documentaries before she joined us here at APTN in 2016. She was an associate producer with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation here in Canada, CBC Manitoba. For their investigative team, she produced nationwide projects for their Indigenous unit and has been nominated for a number of national awards. And most recently, her and the team from APTN Investigates, their most recent was the Canadian Association of Journalists Open Broadcast Feature Award for their documentary Broken Circle. And I also want to introduce you to Brittany Gio. Brittany grew up here in Winnipeg, like me, and she is a member of the Northlands, the Nesuline First Nation. And Brittany came to APTN through CAJ APTN Investigative Fellowship. She now is an investigative reporter with APTN Investigates, has a keen interest in justice reporting, and did much of the research for the work that went into Broken Trust. So that's our panel, and let's get right into it. Holly, I want to go to you. We heard some of the steps that led to this, but can you tell us how this work came together, how it started with you?
Sure. So we didn't break this story. It was actually broken by the Vancouver Sun, a newspaper in Vancouver. And it was just a little blurb that says, alleged scheme harms over a dozen Indigenous teenagers in care. And I actually stood up from my desk and I went, WTF, like there is more to this story than this little small article. So I started to think that, given the number, the sheer overwhelming number of kids in this scheme who were Indigenous, that there had to be something else at work. So I started following the comments on the Facebook page for the Vancouver Sun, and clearly it emerged the number of these victims were writing in and leaving comments because they had all been anonymized because they were kids in care. So I got in touch with a number of them and said, hey, what you up to? I'm a reporter, I'm a producer, and I developed a really close relationship with Aiden Withers, who is actually the young woman who is being interrogated in the sex assault video. So it was one of those instinctual moments as a reporter where you go, oh, there's a big story here. And as it turned out, there was. So Colin Crozier was dispatched to produce an episode of APTN Investigates for us. He did an amazing job with Aiden. And one of the things that Aiden had said to me when we were doing our pre-interview was, I reported a sexual assault and they ignored it. And I thought, okay, well, there must be video of this somewhere. So when she brought her civil case against the BC ministry, her lawyer actually subpoenaed this interrogation video, and we obtained it, and it just was a calamity. So that's how we managed to do subsequent stories with Aiden. Again, as a journalist, source development is really important to me, and as a journalist working in an Indigenous community, those are relationships you have for life, right?
Yeah, we'll talk more about those relationships and impacts the reporting has on people and communities. But I want to go to Brittany. Brittany, you did a lot of assisting, and could you just maybe tell us how court reporting assisted in this story?
Yeah, so my role was primarily as a researcher on the project. And I assisted with obtaining the original court documents that the team needed to proceed with. As Holly said, she came over to my desk and said that this was like a pretty incredible story that was coming out of BC, and we needed to get the court documents. So in Canada, all the provinces have different rules about what is public and what's not. There were numerous filings against the province of British Columbia and the social worker involved. And so I obtained those filings and then summarized them for the Investigates team.
Now, I got to ask you, as a young Indigenous woman, what was your reaction when you saw that video?
For myself, and I think for many Indigenous people, this comes as no surprise and no shock, really. She came to report a serious personal injury and was effectively re-victimized in terms of how her interview went. So I was saddened to see how this young Indigenous woman was treated.
And you have a background in justice. Can you just explain a little bit, how does that inform the journalism that you're doing here at APTN?
Yeah, so having studied criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg has allowed me to better understand policing, corrections, and the court systems in Canada. It has definitely helped me when reading through court documents. Sometimes the language and terminology is very specific, so it helps to have an idea of what they're discussing, especially in terms of the way in which we talk about crime, offenders, and victims, and how to avoid talking about those things in a way that won't further harm or stigmatize those individuals.
Good points, and those are always things that we are thinking as we do our work as journalists. Mary, we talked a lot about your work in this area and how you started doing some of the work and being one of the first of many reporters to start reporting on these issues. Can you tell us how you started reporting on these types of issues?
Sure. Well, I was asked by a magazine editor, actually from the Matt Rothschild from the Progressive, back in like 2010. There was a report from Amnesty International that came out called "The Maze of Injustice," and Sarah Deer, who you may have heard of, was super involved in women's issues, Native women's issues here on the U.S. side. She helped author that report, and it was just about the high rates of sexual violence against Native women, and that, of course, mainstream America totally overlooks it. And it was the first time that I'd ever really seen too much in the mainstream, about this issue. It was like it suddenly became, quote unquote, a thing. And so this Matt, I was just really adamant that I should write about it, and I was very reluctant. I said, that's not really my wheelhouse, and I didn't, that wasn't something I wanted to write about. But what I ended up doing was writing about my own sexual assaults, and that, sort of segued into a much broader look at, I came to see my, other sisters, Indigenous sisters had similar experiences. I think that at that time, like in 2010, the number was, I think it was like 2 of 3 Native women had been sexually assaulted. And we all sort of said we wanted to know who that other woman was who hadn't been assaulted, because everybody we knew had been. So I just began kind of pursuing that line of inquiry on a lot of different levels, how sexual violence does permeate Native women's lives, and how it's really ignored, certainly by the mainstream, and that we really don't report it. It's just sort of like normalized. And so I began looking at sex trafficking, and then eventually missing and murdered Indigenous women, as I came, of course, to, be aware of the outstanding work that was being done by Sisters to the North in Canada, the National Inquiry. Of course, myself and some other women down here began to wonder, gosh, it certainly must be the same thing down here. We have more Native people here in the States than are in Canada. And of course, for us as Indigenous folks, that border is really kind of meaningless. So, of course, I found out, yes, it is, an issue here. And I began reporting on that. So, and I did that, up until really a couple of years ago. It actually kind of took a lot out of me emotionally. And I found that I needed to kind of take a break from it. So I still occasionally will do a story about it, but it's very emotionally draining to hear a lot of the details of these stories. And I find anyway, over and over again. And I always do feel that when women call me, it's primarily women, that I really do have to listen to them. I really do owe them that. But it does, I find it takes quite a lot out of me. And on the plus side, I think I've done a better job of learning how to take care of myself and to recognize when I'm maybe overstretched, emotionally.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we want to be there for each other as journalists, and when we get together at conferences, share stories with each other, but also practice self-care as we're doing the job. I want to get back to something that we talked about, and the communities, and what impact the reporting and these stories have on communities and people in them. Mary, what was some of the things that you were hearing from people on the ground in the communities when you were doing your stories?
Well, a lot, of course, a lot of people don't talk about it. It was just, no, that doesn't happen. There was a lot of denial and shame, I think. There's always sort of some attitude that somehow we've invited those things to happen to us. But then, as both myself and a lot of other activists began making it more public, and as people began to write about it, I think women, a lot of people were just really grateful that, wow, this is like, there's a space being created so that we can be heard about this. So I just had, oh my gosh, so many people contacting me, sharing similar stories, similar situations. It's like, finally, maybe the time has come. Things have sort of coalesced, and in this country to create a space where we might actually be heard. So I think there was a certain relief, really.
Now, Holly, I know you have, through your work, heard from many family members, affected family members of missing and murdered. Can you tell us what you heard from communities, from some of the reporting out of this story? What were people saying when we published these?
I just wanted to get back to Mary's point as well about, and really like a shout out to her, because she was one of the pioneering reporters on this issue. And, I had worked in newsrooms where you would ask to do an MMIWG story, and the attitude would be, well, we did one last month, girls go missing all the time. And really the MMIWG problem is where misogyny and racism collide. And really, that, as somebody who's covered the National Inquiry for APTN, I take Mary's point about self-care, that you really have to have a robust regimen of self-care in order to absorb that vicarious trauma. So I keep a very happy life because I hear so many sad things. But I could no longer do investigative work that didn't have impact. I didn't want to do stories about used car salesmen. I wanted to do stories like this, where there was an immediate and serious condemnation of the officer's behavior against this young woman. So what happened right in of course, we got thousands of retweets. The story blazed around the world. We had the exclusive, but we did share tape with other news outlets because our reach is only so wide and far. So I felt like once we had that tape, we could really see for the first time this intersection of misogyny and sexism and racism all in one moment. And so what I heard over and over again at the National Inquiry is, we did go to police. They told us she was partying. They said she was a runaway. I did go to police. I reported my sexual assault, and they demeaned me. They made me feel awful. And here on video was exactly that experience. So in Canada, we have a parliament, and there's an opposition and the government, and they're all in one house. It's called like two sides of the house. And both sides got up and universally condemned the behavior of this officer. And it was the first time in my career that, you didn't have the conservatives on one side and the liberals on the other side. You had everybody pissed off. And the justice minister immediately said he was going to look into it. But more importantly, what I found was that I did get a call from Marian Buller, who was the head of the National Inquiry, to say, this is what we've been hearing all along. But even more important than that, I got calls from other women and tweets from other women and Facebook messages from other women who said, this is exactly what happened to me. And since the reporting, a number of women have come forward to say, this is exactly what happened to me. Now, do they have video evidence of it? No. But it was very vindicating for them to see that this young woman could stand up to a system that had not only brutalized her through the child welfare system. She got ripped off by her social worker. She was sexually abused and assaulted. She was left poor and homeless. She was exposed to drugs. Here's this woman with all these hits against her, standing up in a national media story and saying, hey, that was me and this is wrong. And that to me was, probably one of the highlights of my career, including talking to her mother, who had a whole history of socioeconomic issues that, why she gave her up. She gave her up like many people and Indigenous people because she thought she would have a better life within the system. And so talking to her mother was probably even more poignant because she was really proud of her kid for pushing through and suing the government and essentially getting a settlement for it. So the impact on community was amazing. The political impact was amazing. But even more importantly was the fact that a statistic came out of a reinvestigation of sexual assault cases that showed that this Kelowna detachment had a 40% dismissal rate of sexual assault cases. So we knew from work that other journalists have done, the Globe and Mail with their Unfounded series, the police do not take these seriously. Well, this Kelowna detachment was even taking it less seriously. And so there were parts of the reporting that we didn't report that statistic. That was actually discovered by another news outlet, but it prompted interest and it sparked all this great reporting. And I thought, this is what journalism is. This is what investigative journalism is.
Yeah, and a few folks took pieces and did pieces of reporting as being recognized for the Richard LaCourse Award. You're named on there, Holly and Brittany, executive producer of Aptn Investigates, Paul Barnsley, video journalist Colin Crozier. We also had some folks in news come and jump on board and file as part of this. Maybe you could explain just a little bit about that and how that extension worked. And
so, yeah, because essentially this was, after Colin had finished, he has to go on to another show right away. And so I'm a producer, but I'm a journalist first. And so I always have little projects that are bubbling around just in case. So this was a project that clearly needed some coordination. The young woman at the heart of this wouldn't speak to anybody except for me. And so I did fly to Kelowna and spent 3 or 4 days with her, but I needed help. Journalism is a team sport. That's what somebody used to always say to me. So I wanted to give people here a piece of it, so that, because we have all sorts of experience, like many newsrooms, we have people with 30 years experience and people with 3 years experience. And I really wanted everybody to get a piece of it. So we had Lori Hamlin, we had Kathleen Martins, who's got a veteran journalist. Brittany Hobson did the television reporting. And again, getting those Indigenous voices on screen is so important to me. I don't need to stand in front of a camera and be like, I found this. I want people like Brittany Hobson. I want people like Brittany Guillot to just run with it. This is what we found. Just go. This is everyone's.
So each person played a role in getting various parts of the story out on various platforms. As you mentioned, Brittany Hobson, her story would have aired on the national news,
Yeah.
and we had Kathleen, another one of our reporters who has done many stories on the National Enquiry. And if we could just circle back to that, Holly, because that was a pretty impactful thing to hear from Marion Buller. And some folks may have looked at the National Enquiry as somewhat of a victory that we had some recognition here in Canada for that issue. As someone who's spoken to so many family members, maybe you can just talk about what they say about that inquiry.
So the inquiry was, some people see it as a victory. I see it as a roadmap. I mean, the work that still needs to be done is just immense, right? There was a collective soul sighing operation, in the sense that families finally got to get these things off of their chest. But what's changed? We have an RCMP in this country. We have a commissioner who denied that there was systemic racism. Well, you can't come out of that national inquiry as somebody who sat there day after day and listened to hours of testimony. There's no debate whether there's systemic racism in the justice system against Indigenous people. And I would be really interested to hear Mary's take on this from the US, because looking to us as this big national inquiry, what it really did is expose the problems, but not create a whole bunch of solutions. And so my question is for Mary, in terms of, like, when you were doing all of that reporting, were you hoping that there would be a national inquiry, or that the government would somehow take up the call?
Yeah. And because I was thinking you guys had laid the groundwork for that. Yeah, and this issue, we now have this term, systemic racism, and I like that term. It's a really helpful term. Someone once said to me, it took a long time to build these structures of systemic racism and entrenched racism. So it's going to take some time to dismantle them. I mean, they're so deeply embedded. For instance, I think always of Duluth, Minnesota, and that women would, for generations, they would quote unquote work the boats, and women were often assaulted. Sometimes women disappeared, and it was sort of you really got the sense that for generations the opinion of the police as well, that's just part of the rough and tumble kind of milieu of a port town. It was normalized, and certainly there was no place for women to go. What if they did go? If they did go, they were concerned that perhaps the police would find a charge against them for something else. So I mean, there was really very, very little motivation to report things. So it's still going to take a long time.